Surely many remember the distant 1994 for being a very special year in the world of video games, when Nintendo and Rareware formed one of the most memorable alliances of the industry to which they belong. It is in this context that the video game of Donkey Kong Country was born, a graphic revolution in its time and a very innocent game, suitable for all types of audience. Since the departure of DKC was already a second part, because Nintendo and Rare would not miss the opportunity to take forward the jewel they had just created, and a year later, in 1995 comes Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest, one of the best deliveries for the old Super Nintendo, an innovative title and just as innocent as its predecessor. Apparently, we all know that in beta versions of video games many elements are left behind, scenarios, characters, items, etc. DKC2 was not the exception. In the list of enemies was a mysterious character somewhat different from the rest of villains. It was Mr. X, a pirate like the other enemies of the game but with a somewhat different air. Unlike most, Mr. X was a ghost, and even though we can find other ghosts in the game, this one looked a bit more sinister. He carried a sword, which is common in the enemies of this title. He had no legs, instead of hands he had two hooks. His skin was white and with red eyeballs and black retinas, a hat and a torn captain's jacket. These were the characteristics that made up that character, but it is not their appearance that makes it unsettling. We all know Nintendo as the innocent child of the video game industry. Its catalog at that time was much softer than today, had much to do with the censorship of the time, but also the strict norms of violence that Nintendo had in those days, even going so far as to criticize this company for removing the blood of video games like Mortal Kombat. Nintendo soon understood that this was annoying and in many cases even unacceptable for video players, so it began to be more flexible, leaving the blood for the second installment of Mortal Kombat among other new freedoms, but there was a point where these freedoms went further. Nintendo wanted to break with its stereotype of video games for children and decided to do so with the second installment of his Ape, So I entrusted Rare with a video game much more mature but still acceptable for children. As you can see, this is a contradiction in itself. With this confusing description, Rare got down to work. All those who have played DKC2 will remember King K. Rool, known in this second part as Captain K. Rool, as the final boss of the game, the leader of the pirate Kremlings and king of the Kremling Island. However, originally he would not be Originally K. Rool would not appear in the game. This was because, according to the book of the beta version that was accidentally packed in the game box for the German market, K. Rool was killed by a powerful specter named Mr. X. More ahead in the book, in the section of characters in the section of enemies, was the image of this spectrum. Next to the image of this one was a small text that said Mr. X Kane Mensch kennt noder hat in irgendwo schon einmal gesehen. What it means, Mr. X nobody knows him or has seen him anywhere before. Mr. X was conceived to be the main villain of this installment. He would kill K. Rool after kidnapping Candy Kong, Donkey Kong's girlfriend, for considering that he would no longer need it. Then Donkey and Diddy decide to go to the rescue of Candy, reason why they venture to the island of the Kremlings. Already on the island, Funky Kong gives them weapons, but not the innocent weapons of Donkey Kong 64, if not real weapons. They would explode the enemies by firing them, causing them to fire blood. The idea of real weapons was considered again for the 64 version, but as in the Super Nintendo, it was discarded. The video game became bloodier as it progressed, as the number of enemies to be killed increased. The adversaries of this beta are very different from their counterparts of the final version, because when they used their weapons they had a more real effect, that is, their swords really cut our characters, just as the cannons crushed them, making a more violent show. As in all video games of that time, in the game the story was little or no, so to know, you had to check the book that accompanied the game in its box. This book of the beta version, as I said earlier, was packed by mistake in a box of the final version of the game for Germany, revealed the plot that this would have had been completed. It turns out that Mr. X's goal was to come back to life, To achieve this he had to sacrifice Candy under a Kremlin ritual of black magic, although in the book it is not revealed because specifically it can be assumed that this is because in those days the story of a video game was not very important, all efforts were focused mainly on the game's skill, or else, that this would be revealed within the plot of the game. When the beta version ended with a few levels, the testators were called to comment on the game and look for bugs. None wanted to finish the first world, because they found the violence of the game very crude, as well as bizarre for its caricatured characters, mainly because they had already met them a year before with a more innocent side. Nintendo and Rare finally decided to discard much of the beta material and return to the original formula, but adding the improvements we already know of the final version. However, this failed attempt left a legacy, as Nintendo and Rare opted to do it once again, this time with unpublished characters to avoid the old reactions, and that was how the classic Conker's Bad Fur Day was born.